Out on the prairie in the year of our Lord 1874, you didn't just die from bullets or snake bites. Sometimes you died of silence, the kind of quiet that gets inside your bones and hollows you out from the inside. Clara knew that silence. It was her only neighbor. For 3 years, since the fever had stolen her husband Thomas and left her a widow at 27, the silence had been her unwelcome guest. It sat with her at her small wooden table. It lay beside her in her cold, empty bed. The wind was the only thing that ever spoke back. It howled around her little cabin, rattling the window pane like a trapped spirit. It was a lonely sound in a lonely world. She had built a wall around her heart, stone by careful stone. Each day was the same: chop wood, haul water, tend the garden, survive. Don't think about the laughter that used to fill this tiny space. Don't remember the warmth of his hand. Just survive. But the prairie, it always has other plans. One afternoon, the wind carried something new. Not his usual mournful song, but shouts. Sharp, angry, human. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs. Trouble was a rare visitor, and it never came for a friendly chat. She crept to the top of the small rise behind her cabin, her knuckles white as she gripped the dry earth. She peered over the top, towards the trail that led to the nearest settlement, a place she hadn't visited in months. And what she saw turned her blood to ice. 4 riders, settlers by the look of their dusty clothes and grim faces. They weren't just passing through. They were stopped by the stand of cottonwood trees at the edge of her property line, and they had someone with them. At first, she thought it was a scarecrow, a grim warning left for others, a figure tied to the thick trunk of the oldest cottonwood. But then she saw it move, a slight shift of the shoulders, the chest rising and falling in a shallow, ragged breath. It wasn't a scarecrow, it was a man. Her breath caught in her throat. She should go back inside, pretend she saw nothing. This was settler business, and she was just a ghost on this land, a woman who knew how to be invisible. Survival meant staying invisible, but her eyes were fixed on the scene. The men were rough, their movements efficient and cruel. They checked the ropes one last time, thick rawhide that cut into the man's skin. Then, without a backward glance, they mounted their horses and rode off, their laughter swallowed by the wind. Leaving the man to die, slowly, under the relentless, baking sun. Clara stayed hidden, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the dry dirt. She watched the lone figure, slumped against the tree. She could see the dark skin, the long black braid of hair. A Native American, a warrior. The word itself was a spark in the dry tinder of the frontier. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her carefully constructed walls. Stories whispered around campfires, tales of raids and bloodshed, of a war that was never declared but was always being fought. He was the enemy. All the ingrained warnings, every rule of survival screamed at her. Go back, lock the door. This is not your fight. To interfere was to invite death to her own doorstep. He was a savage, they said, a threat to be eliminated, but she couldn't look away. She watched as the sun climbed higher, beating down on him. Thirst would be the first torment, then the heat, cooking him alive inside his own skin. Then the animals that came with the night. It was a cruelty she couldn't stomach. She thought of Thomas, his body burning with fever, his desperate, helpless gasps for air. She remembered the feeling of being powerless, of watching someone suffer and being able to do nothing. She couldn't do anything for Thomas, but she could do something for this man. The thought was terrifying. It was madness, an act of rebellion against the brutal logic of this land. But the image of him dying, alone, while she sat safe in her cabin, that was a weight her soul refused to bear. She waited, an hour, then 2. The sun was a merciless hammer in the sky. The riders were long gone, just specks of dust on the horizon. The decision settled in her gut, heavy and certain. She stood up, her legs trembling, and walked back to the cabin. Her movements were stiff, robotic. She went to the creek, her hands shaking as she filled a metal dipper with cool, clear water. Then she went back inside. From the workbench, where Thomas had kept his tools, she picked up a knife. Its blade was worn, but sharp. The weight of it in her hand felt dangerous. Final. She took one last look around her small, silent home. This was the line. Once she crossed it, there would be no going back. Then, setting her jaw, she walked out the door and headed for the cottonwood trees. Each step was a battle. Her mind screamed warnings, painting vivid pictures of what those settlers would do to her if they found out. What he might do to her if she set him free. He was a warrior, after all, a wild, untamed thing. But her feet kept moving, carrying her forward, one step after another towards the bound man. As she got closer, the details became sharper. He was younger than she'd thought. Lean, with muscles coiled tight, even in his exhaustion. His face was bruised and cut, but his eyes were open. They were fixed on her, dark, intense, and unreadable. He watched her approach with the wary stillness of a cornered wolf. There was no fear in his gaze, only a raw, unbroken pride. He was defeated, but he was not beaten. She stopped a few feet away, holding out the dipper of water. The metal trembled in her hand. The silence between them was thick, charged with a century of hatred and mistrust. He was the enemy who haunted the settlers' nightmares. She was one of the people who were stealing his land, his way of life. Water, she said. Her voice was a dry rasp, rough from disuse. He didn't move. His eyes narrowed, tracking her every twitch, every breath. He probably didn't understand the word, but he understood the offering, and he didn't trust it. Why would he? Kindness was a foreign currency in this part of the world. She held the dipper steady, her arm starting to ache. It was such a small thing, a cup of water. But out here, it felt like a treaty, a betrayal, a prayer. Finally, after a lifetime stretched into a few seconds, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Acceptance. Clara moved closer, her heart hammering. She knelt in the dry grass beside him, the heat from his body radiating outwards. She raised the dipper to his lips. His eyes never left hers, sharp with a vigilance that made her skin crawl. But his lips, cracked and bleeding, parted. He drank, long and deep. Water trickled down his chin, tracing clean paths through the grime on his skin. When he was done, he pulled back slightly, a long, shuddering breath escaping his chest. He still hadn't spoken. Her gaze fell to the rawhide ropes. They were tied with an expert, cruel tightness. His wrists were raw and bloody from his struggles. This wasn't just about water. The fear came back, a cold whisper in her ear. You've done enough. Now walk away. It's not too late. Just leave him. It's what everyone expects. But she looked at his face, at the stark dignity etched into his bruised features, and she knew she couldn't. It was illogical. It was suicide. But the choice had already been made in that hollowed-out part of her heart where grief had lived for so long. She held up the knife. His eyes flickered from her face to the blade and back again. A flash of surprise crossed his features, so quick she almost missed it. He thought she was here to finish the job, to end his suffering in a different, quicker way. I'll cut you loose, she stammered, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. He didn't understand her words, but he must have understood her intent. The hard lines of his face softened just a fraction. The suspicion in his eyes didn't disappear, but something else flickered there, a dawning disbelief. She knelt again, positioning the knife against the thick rope at his wrists. The rawhide was tough, stretched taut against his skin. She had to saw at it carefully, the blade biting slowly. He remained perfectly still, watching her. She could feel the tension in his muscles, the heat of his skin. The air was thick with unspoken questions. What kind of woman was she? What did she want from him? With a final sharp pull, the rope snapped. His hands, raw and purple, fell into his lap. He flexed his fingers slowly, painfully as the blood rushed back into them. She moved to his ankles and cut the bonds there as well. When he was free, he didn't move. He just sat there, rubbing his wrists, his intense gaze never leaving her. He was assessing her, trying to understand the impossible thing that had just happened. You are hurt, she said, gesturing to the cuts on his face and a deeper gash on his thigh that was still sluggishly bleeding. He understood the gesture. A grimace twisted his lips as he touched his cheekbone. My cabin, she said, speaking slowly, pointing back the way she came. It's small, but safe. from the sun. It was the most reckless invitation she had ever made. She was offering shelter to the enemy, an act that would get her shunned at best, hanged at worst. If Brody and his men ever found out, they would burn her cabin to the ground with her inside it. But the alternative, watching him stumble off into the prairie, wounded and weak, only to be hunted down or collapse from his injuries, was no longer an option. He looked from her face towards her distant cabin, then back. He was weighing the offer, the incredible risk. Trusting her was just as dangerous as not trusting her. For all he knew, this was an elaborate trap. The wind whispered through the cottonwood leaves, the only sound in a world holding its breath. He pushed himself to his feet, favoring his injured leg. He was taller than she'd realized, his presence commanding even in his weakened state. The warrior was still there, just beneath the surface. He pointed a finger at her cabin, then at himself. He tapped his own chest, then gestured to her. A silent question. You? Me? In your home? She nodded, a lump forming in her throat. Yes. He studied her face for a long moment, searching for any sign of deceit. She met his gaze without flinching, hoping he could see the weary resolve in her eyes, the strange, defiant compassion that had driven her to this point. Finally, he gave another one of his small, decisive nods. Callan, he said. The word was low and rough, like stones grinding together. He tapped his chest again. It was his name. Clara, she replied, touching her own chest. A name for a name. A beginning. He took a tentative step, testing his injured leg. He moved with the coiled grace of a predator, even when wounded. She turned and began to walk back towards her cabin. She didn't look back to see if he was following. She just walked, her back straight, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. She heard the soft tread of his moccasins on the dry earth behind her. He was following. She had just invited the wilderness itself into her home, and she had no idea what she had just unleashed. The moment Kaylin stepped over her threshold, the small cabin seemed to shrink. The air grew thick, charged with a tension so powerful she could almost taste it. He stood just inside the door, a towering, silent presence, his dark eyes sweeping over everything. The rough-hewn table, the small cot with its worn quilt, the fireplace, the few meager possessions that made up her entire world. He was like a hawk brought into a sparrow's nest. Everything was wrong. Everything was dangerous. His gaze stopped on his own leg. The torn fabric of his leggings was soaked in a dark, spreading stain of blood from the gash on his thigh. Sit, she said, pointing to the single wooden chair. She wasn't sure if he would obey or if he would even allow her to touch him again. He watched her for a long moment, his face an unreadable mask. Then, to her surprise, he moved to the chair and sat, extending his injured leg. He pulled back the torn leather, revealing a nasty, jagged wound. It was deep, caked with dirt and dried blood. It needed cleaning. Badly. Clara's stomach churned, but she moved with a purpose she didn't feel. This at least was familiar territory. It was like tending to Thomas, but with a terrifying new edge. The man she was helping wasn't her husband. He was a stranger from a world that wanted hers gone. She brought a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. She knelt before him, her hands surprisingly steady. He watched her face the entire time, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. But he didn't flinch, not even when she cleaned the grit from the raw wound. His stoicism was absolute, a wall of stone she couldn't possibly penetrate. When she finished, she tore strips from an old linen sheet and carefully bound the injury. Her fingers brushed against his skin. It was warm and taut, and the contact sent a jolt through her, a strange mixture of fear and something else, something she refused to name. You need to rest, she said, gesturing toward the small cot. It was her bed, the only one she had. He looked at the cot, then back at her. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not gratitude, not yet, but maybe a grudging respect, or just the weary acceptance of a body that had reached its limit. He pushed himself up, moving stiffly, and crossed the room. He lay down on the cot, his powerful frame nearly spilling over the sides. He didn't close his eyes. He lay on his back, arms crossed over his chest, a warrior at rest but never at ease. Still watchful, always watchful. Clara tried to go about her evening chores, but her movements were clumsy. She was acutely aware of him, of his presence filling her small, quiet space. The silence in the cabin was different now. It was no longer the empty, hollow silence of loneliness. It was a living, breathing silence, filled with the presence of another human being. A dangerous, unpredictable one. She prepared a simple meal of beans and stale bread. She ate at the table, her back to him, but she could feel his eyes on her. She offered him a plate, but he just shook his head, his gaze never wavering. He hadn't spoken another word since telling her his name. The gulf between their worlds was vast, a chasm of language and culture that seemed impossible to cross. As night fell, the cabin became a tiny island of light in an ocean of darkness. The wind picked up, its mournful howl a reminder of the vast, empty world outside. Clara banked the fire, her mind racing. What had she done? She was harboring a fugitive, an enemy of her people. Discovery didn't just mean trouble, it meant death. Brody and his men weren't the forgiving type. They had left Kaylin to die once. They wouldn't hesitate to do it again, and to kill her for interfering. She laid a thin blanket on the floor for herself, near the warmth of the hearth. The cot was his. Sleep seemed impossible. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. She could hear his breathing, slow and steady, from the cot across the room. She was lying on the floor of her own home, a few feet from a man who, under any other circumstances, might have killed her without a second thought. And yet, somewhere beneath the terror, a strange sense of rightness settled over her. She had chosen. She had acted. In a world that demanded cruelty, she had offered a small, defiant act of compassion. It felt like the only truly human thing she had done in years. She must have dozed off because she awoke with a start to the pale, gray light of dawn. And a sudden, chilling realization. The cot was empty. Panic seized her. Her heart leaped into her throat. Had he left? Or worse, was he creeping up on her right now? She sat bolt upright, her eyes scanning the dim room. And then she saw him. He was standing by the window looking out at the sunrise, and in his hand he held Thomas's axe. He was testing its weight, the morning light glinting off the sharpened steel edge. Clara froze, every muscle in her body screaming. The axe, her husband's axe, in the hands of a savage. This was it. This was how she died. For a moment of foolish, misplaced pity. He must have sensed her movement because he turned. His eyes met hers across the small room. His expression was calm, unthreatening. He held the axe up slightly, then nodded towards the woodpile outside the window. A silent question. May I? He wanted to chop her wood. Clara could only stare, bewildered. He was wounded, a fugitive hiding in her home, and he was offering to do her chores. Perhaps it was a debt to be paid, or perhaps it was just the instinct of a man who couldn't stand to be idle. She gave a slow, hesitant nod. Yes. A flicker of understanding passed between them. He gave her that same small, respectful nod he'd given her at the tree. Then he turned and stepped outside, moving with a careful, deliberate grace. A few moments later she heard it, the clean, rhythmic thwack of an axe splitting wood. Clara went to the doorway and watched. The rising sun cast a long shadow behind him as he worked. He moved with an efficient power that was mesmerizing, his shoulders and back muscles flexing with each swing. Even with his injured leg, he was more capable than any man she'd ever seen. It was the most surreal sight of her life, an enemy warrior chopping her firewood as the prairie woke up around them. In that moment, she realized her old life was truly over. The quiet, lonely world of the widow Clara had been shattered, and something new, something terrifying and utterly unpredictable, was just beginning. The days that followed fell into a strange, silent rhythm, a dance of two people from different worlds, trapped together in a bubble of secrecy. Clara tended to Kaylin's wound each morning. It was healing, cleaner now, but it would be a long time before he could travel. She cooked for him, simple meals which he now accepted, eating with a quiet intensity that suggested he hadn't had a proper meal in a very long time. He, in turn, did what he could. He chopped a mountain of firewood, enough to last her through the winter. He reinforced a loose fence post. He even managed to patch a leak in her roof, moving with a surprising agility. Most of the time, though, he would sit outside the cabin door, watchful and still, like a sentinel. He wasn't just resting, he was guarding, protecting her home, protecting her. They barely spoke, but they began to communicate, a language of gestures and shared tasks. He learned to point at the bucket and say, in his deep, resonant voice, Emily, water. She would nod and reply, water. He pointed to the trees. Chan, wood. She would repeat, wood. He was a quick study, his eyes sharp and intelligent. He watched her constantly, not with the wary suspicion of before, but with a quiet, searching curiosity. He watched her knead dough, watched her mend a dress by the firelight, watched her move through the small rituals of her solitary life. She watched him, too. She saw the deep, ancient sadness that sometimes clouded his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. It was a mirror of her own grief, a silent acknowledgement of the losses they had both endured. She saw the fierce pride that was etched into the very lines of his face, and the quiet dignity that never left him, even when he was at his most vulnerable. One evening, as the fire crackled between them, she finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her. She pointed towards the west, towards the setting sun. She made a sweeping gesture with her hand, as if to indicate a large group of people. Your people? Then she mimed being tied to a tree. She pointed at him. Why were you alone? His face grew serious, his jaw tightening. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. But then he began to speak in his own language, a low, flowing river of Lakota words. She didn't understand the sounds, but she understood the story he told with his hands. He pointed west again, then held up 4 fingers. A 4-day ride. That's how far away his people were. He had been part of a small hunting party. He mimed drawing a bow, tracking an animal. Then he made the shape of rifles with his hands. Settlers. An ambush. He had been separated from the others. Captured. He touched the rope burns, still livid on his wrists. Then he made a cutting motion with his hand and pointed at her. And then he did something that made her heart stop. He placed his hand flat over his own heart and looked directly into her eyes. The meaning was unmistakable, more powerful than any word in any language. Gratitude. He then pointed at her, then back at the cabin, his expression growing grim. He drew a finger across his own throat. Danger. He knew. He understood the terrible risk she was taking. They'll come looking for you, she whispered, knowing he wouldn't understand the words, but hoping he would understand the tone. The settlers. Brody. He nodded slowly. He understood perfectly. He had faced death before, she realized. It held no special terror for him, but the idea of bringing that death to her doorstep, that clearly weighed on him. The knowledge hung between them, a shared secret, a heavy burden. Her small act of kindness hadn't just saved his life. It had bound their fates together, for better or for worse. The walls she had built around her heart had started to crumble. This man, this savage, was not the monster she had been taught to fear. He was a man of honor, of quiet strength. And in the silent, shared space of her tiny cabin, the loneliness that had been her constant companion for 3 years began finally to recede. It was a fragile, dangerous peace, and it was about to be shattered. One afternoon, a plume of dust on the horizon signaled an approaching rider. Clara's blood ran cold. It wasn't just any rider. She recognized the shape of the horse, the way the man sat in the saddle. It was Mr. Brody, the stern, unforgiving settler who lived 10 miles away, the leader of the men who had left Kalin to die. Panic, sharp and blinding, seized her. Kalin was outside near the creek, fetching a bucket of water. Exposed. Kalin, she hissed, running to the door. Hide! Rider coming! He looked up, saw the terror in her face, and followed her gaze to the approaching dust cloud. In an instant, the quiet man doing chores vanished. The warrior returned. His eyes narrowed, every muscle in his body coiled and alert. He dropped the bucket and moved with a speed that defied his injured leg, melting into the thicket of trees by the creek without a sound. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She grabbed her own bucket, her hands slick with sweat, and hurried towards the creek herself, trying to look busy, normal, as if her heart wasn't about to explode out of her chest. Brody rode up, his face a thundercloud. He dismounted, his cold eyes scanning everything. The cabin, the woodpile, the ground. He was a man who missed nothing. "Afternoon, Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice as flat and hard as the prairie itself. He never called her Clara, always the formal, distant Mrs. Miller. "Mr. Brody," she replied, forcing her voice to stay even. "Didn't expect to see you out this far." "Business," he grunted, ignoring her attempt at pleasantry. "Saw some tracks near your property line a few days back. Moccasin tracks." His eyes, like chips of blue ice, drilled into her. Clara's stomach twisted into a knot. "Lots of tracks out here, Mr. Brody." "Not like these," he said, taking a step closer. "We had some trouble last week. An ambush. We managed to catch one of them. Taught him a lesson." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Left him tied up over at the cottonwoods. Meant for him to be a warning." He stared at her, waiting, daring her to react. "When we went back to check," he continued, his voice dropping low and menacing, "he was gone. Ropes cut clean." The unspoken accusation was as loud as a gunshot. "You." "I can't imagine why you'd think I know anything about that," she said, her voice sounding thin and reedy to her own ears. "I keep to myself." "Do you?" he sneered. He took another step, invading her space. "Folks find it strange. A woman all alone out here. Surviving. It ain't natural." The threat wasn't just about Kaylin anymore. It was about her. A woman who didn't fit. A woman who didn't need a man to protect her, which in his eyes made her suspicious. Dangerous. "Maybe you got help," he whispered, his breath sour. "Help from the wrong kind of folk." "I managed just fine on my own," she said, looking him straight in the eye, willing her voice not to tremble. He let out a short, ugly laugh. "Is that so? Well, if you see anything, Mrs. Miller, you know your duty. This is our land. We have to protect it." He was watching her like a hawk, trying to read the guilt he was so sure was written on her face. She felt a bead of sweat trickle down her back. Was Kaylin hidden well enough? Could Brody see any sign of him? A broken branch? A footprint in the mud? Finally, with a frustrated grunt, Brody turned back to his horse. "You keep your eyes open," he warned, swinging himself into the saddle. "Trouble's coming, and it has a way of finding people who aren't careful about who they keep company with." The threat was clear. He gave her one last, hard look, then spurred his horse and rode away. Clara didn't move. She stood frozen, watching until he was nothing more than a speck on the horizon. Only then did the breath she'd been holding escape in a ragged, shaky gasp. Her legs felt like jelly. She waited a few more minutes, her eyes scanning the empty prairie, before she dared to call out in a low voice. "Kaylin, he's gone." He emerged from the trees, silent as a shadow. He came towards her, his eyes full of questions. "Settler," she said, her voice trembling. "Brody, he was looking for you. He knows. He knows someone cut you loose." She pointed to herself. "I told him nothing." Kaylin looked at her, his expression grim. He looked in the direction Brody had ridden, then back at her. He understood the danger she was in, the danger he had brought to her. He reached out and, for the first time, he initiated a touch. He placed his hand on her shoulder, his grip firm and steady. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a promise, a soldier's pledge. We are in this together. The encounter with Brody changed everything. Their quiet, fragile peace was gone, replaced by the constant, thrumming hum of fear. They were no longer just a woman and a man. They were accomplices, outlaws. The days that followed were taut with tension. Every shadow, every gust of wind could be Brody and his men returning. Kalen's leg was healing. He was growing stronger, his movements becoming more fluid, more powerful. The warrior was returning to his full strength. And as his body healed, the chasm of silence between them began to close. He started teaching her more of his words. Wanietu, winter, Anpau, dawn. He would say a word and she would repeat it, her tongue clumsy around the unfamiliar sounds. He would smile then, a rare, fleeting thing that transformed his stern face. She taught him more English. Fire, night, danger. They pieced together the stories of their lives with this patchwork language of words and gestures. She learned he had a family, a wife, two small children. He would draw them in the dirt with a stick, his face softening with a love so profound it made her own heartache. He was a protector, a provider, a man who loved his family, not a savage. She, in turn, tried to explain her own life. She led him to the small, weathered wooden cross on the hill behind the cabin. "Thomas," she said, her voice thick, "my husband." Kalen looked at the simple grave, then back at her. He saw the grief she kept so carefully hidden. He placed his hand over his heart, then gestured to the grave, and then to the sky. A gesture of respect, of shared sorrow. Loss was a language they both understood perfectly. In the small, firelit world of the cabin, the prejudices of the outside world began to seem like a distant madness. Here they were not settler and savage, white and red. They were simply Clara and Kalen, two lonely souls who had found a strange, unexpected refuge in each other. But the outside world was not going to leave them alone. It came for them in the dead of night. The sound of horses jolted Clara from a restless sleep. Not one rider this time, many, and they were close. "Kalen," she whispered, scrambling from her blanket on the floor. He was already on his feet, a silent shadow by the window. His body was tense, coiled like a spring. The faint light from their banked fire would be a beacon in the darkness. "They're here," she breathed, her heart pounding with a sick, heavy dread. Kalen turned from the window, his eyes blazing in the firelight. He looked at Thomas's axe, leaning by the door. He was a warrior, and a warrior's first instinct is to fight. "No," Clara said, grabbing his arm. His muscle was like stone beneath her touch. "There are too many. You can't fight them all." He looked at her, then around the tiny cabin. There was nowhere to run, no escape. A loud, brutal pounding on the door made them both jump. "Mrs. Miller, we know he's in there. Open this door." It was Brody's voice, raw with fury. They knew. Somehow, they knew for sure. Kalen looked at Clara, a silent question in his eyes. He was ready to die fighting, but he would not surrender. Clara's mind raced, fueled by adrenaline and terror. She couldn't let them take him. She wouldn't. After everything they had shared, after the fragile trust they had built, handing him over would be the ultimate betrayal. It would be a betrayal of herself. "The floor," she said, her voice a sharp, urgent whisper. She dragged him towards the small back room she used for storage. "Under the floorboards." Thomas made a hiding place. Kalen hesitated. Hiding was not a warrior's way. "Please," she begged, her hands on his chest, pushing him. "Trust me." The pounding on the door grew more violent, the wood groaning in protest. He looked into her eyes, and whatever he saw there made him relent. He gave a sharp nod and slipped into the back room. She heard the scrape of the loose floorboards, then silence. She rushed after him, smoothed a dusty blanket over the spot, her hands trembling so badly she could barely function. "Open up, or we're breaking it down." She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked to the door. Her fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but something else was rising to meet it, a fierce, protective anger. They would not have him. She lifted the heavy bar and pulled the door open. 4 men stood there, their faces cruel and hard in the moonlight. Brody was at the front, his rifle held at the ready. "Took you long enough," he snarled, pushing past her into the cabin. The other men fanned out, their eyes darting into every dark corner. "It's the middle of the night, Mr. Brody," she said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. "Cut the act," another man growled. "We want the savage." "I don't know what you're talking about," she insisted, her heart hammering. "He's here," Brody said, his eyes scanning the room. "Someone's been helping him, and you're the only one for miles. It all adds up." He started towards the back room. Clara's blood ran cold. She moved to block his path. "There's nothing in there but some old tools." Brody stopped, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at her. Her defiance surprised him, and it confirmed his suspicions. "Get out of my way, Mrs. Miller." "No." The word was small, but it felt like a roar. Brody's face contorted with rage. "Are you protecting him? Aiding the enemy? That's a hanging offense." "He was a man left to die," she cried, the words bursting out of her. raw and passionate. "I gave him water. I cleaned his wounds. What kind of people are you?" "He's not a man, he's an animal," one of the others spat. "He has a name," she shouted back, her fear forgotten, replaced by a white-hot fury. "His name is Kalen. He's a better man than any of you." Her fierce defense stunned them into a moment of silence. They had expected a frightened, lonely widow, not a lioness. Brody recovered first. "You've gone mad. Living out here alone has rotted your brain." He raised his hand to shove her aside, and at that exact moment, from the back room, came a faint but unmistakable sound. A floorboard creaked. Every head snapped towards the sound. A look of triumphant fury spread across Brody's face. "There!" he roared. "He's in there! Get him!" The men surged forward. Clara screamed, throwing herself into the narrow doorway, but Brody threw her to the floor like a rag doll. Her head hit the hard-packed earth with a sickening thud. The men stormed into the back room. She heard scuffling, shouts, a grunt of effort. Then Kalen exploded out of the darkness. He hadn't been deep in the hiding spot. He had been waiting, ready. He was unarmed, but he moved with a blur of speed that was terrifying. In his hands, he gripped the first thing he could find in the darkness. Thomas's old, heavy shovel. He stood between Clara and the men, his legs braced, the shovel held like a war club. His chest was heaving, his eyes narrowed to slits of pure, primal fury. He let out a guttural cry, a Lakota war cry that filled the small cabin and shook it to its foundation. "Kalen!" Clara cried, scrambling to her feet. Brody raised his rifle, taking aim. "Drop it, savage!" Kalen didn't move. He was a cornered animal, ready to fight to the death. And in that split second, something inside Clara snapped. She was no longer a widow. She was no longer a victim. She was a warrior, too. She lunged for the fireplace, her hand closing around the handle of the heavy cast-iron skillet. With a wordless scream of her own, she swung it with all her might at the man closest to Brody. The skillet connected with the side of his head with a sickening crack. He staggered back, his eyes rolling up in his head as he crumpled to the floor. The sudden, shocking attack created the opening Kalen needed. He moved, a whirlwind of desperate violence. He swung the shovel in a wide, vicious arc, the heavy steel blade catching Brody's rifle and sending it flying from his hands. Brody howled in pain and surprise. Chaos erupted. In the cramped space of the cabin, rifles were clumsy. The shovel was not. Kalen was a demon, his weapon a blur, his limp forgotten. He parried a blow, shoved a man back, his movements economical and deadly. Clara, her eyes wide, the heavy skillet still in her hand, stood her ground, ready to strike again. Brody, recovering, drew a pistol from his belt, but Kalen was faster. He brought the shovel down with all his force, not on a man, but on the iron hook holding the pot of water over the fire. The hook snapped. The pot crashed down onto the hearth, sending an explosion of scalding water and steam hissing across the floor. The men yelled, jumping back, blinded and confused. It was their only chance. "Go!" Kalen roared, grabbing Clara's arm. He dragged her towards the open door. They burst out into the cold night air, leaving a scene of chaos and confusion behind them. They could hear shouts and curses from inside the cabin. "Don't let them get away!" Shots rang out, the bullets cracking past their ears in the darkness. They ran, stumbling over the uneven ground, pure adrenaline fueling their flight. Kalen pulled her towards the dark line of trees by the creek, his grip on her arm like iron. They plunged into the darkness of the woods just as the men spilled out of the cabin, their rifles blazing. Kalen pulled her down behind a thick tangle of bushes, shielding her body with his own. His breathing was a harsh, ragged sound in the sudden quiet. He held her tight, his heart hammering against her back. The men were crashing through the underbrush, their voices getting closer. They were trapped. Kalen shifted, his body tensing. He was preparing to make a final stand. Then a voice called out from the distance. "Brody! Over here! I see tracks! Heading for the ridge!" The footsteps near them hesitated, then turned, moving away, following the false trail. They listened, holding their breath, as the sounds of the pursuit faded into the night. They were safe, for now. Kalen slowly relaxed his hold, but he didn't let her go. In the darkness, surrounded by the quiet sounds of the prairie night, the world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them. He turned, his face so close to hers she could feel his breath on her cheek. He gently raised a hand and touched her face, his calloused fingers tracing the line of her jaw. "Clara," he whispered. Her name sounded different on his tongue, foreign yet somehow perfectly right. "Callan," she breathed back. And then in the quiet darkness, he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, fierce, a raw, explosive release of all the fear and tension, of all the unspoken things that had passed between them. It was a kiss that tasted of gunpowder and wood smoke and the impossible, undeniable truth of their connection. When they finally broke apart, the world had changed. The line had not just been crossed, it had been erased. They stayed hidden until the first pale light of dawn painted the sky. The settlers were gone. They emerged from the trees, cold, stiff, and exhausted. The cabin stood silent, the door hanging open like a wound. It was no longer a home. It was a crime scene. "We can't stay," Clara said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Her life here was over. Brody would never stop hunting them. Kalen nodded, his face grim. He looked towards the west, where the sun was still a promise below the horizon. Then he looked at her. He tapped his chest, then hers. Then he swept his hand toward the west. "Come with me." The offer was terrifying. A journey into the unknown, into a world that was not hers, with a man she barely knew, yet trusted with her life. She looked at her small cabin, at the grave on the hill. The life she had known was a ghost. To stay was to die. To go with him, that was a chance to live. She met his gaze, her decision made. "Yes," she said, "I will go with you." A look of profound relief washed over his face. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. They gathered what little they could, a blanket, the last of the bread, and Thomas's rifle. As the sun climbed into the sky, they turned their backs on the cabin and walked away. They walked west, two solitary figures against a vast, unforgiving landscape. A widow and a warrior, fugitives, outlaws. They were heading into the heart of the wilderness, hunted and alone. But for the first time in a very long time, Clara did not feel lonely. She felt the firm grip of his hand in hers, a steady anchor in a world turned upside down. It was the end of her story, and the beginning of theirs. If you enjoyed this story of survival and the courage to defy a brutal world, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss the incredible tales we have coming next.